He told me I could sleep somewhere else if I was going to talk to his wife that way. My son said it without raising his voice, without pounding his fist, but it landed like a slammed door. I stood there with a jar of sugar and pectin on the counter and the smell of peaches under my nails, and I looked past him to where her ring light glowed in the living room like a false moon. I didn't answer. I set the jar down and walked to the back porch. From there, I could see the stump where a tree used to stand, the one Leo and I planted the summer our first boy came home. That tree had watched homework, arguments, and barbecues. It had held winter lights in its limbs and summer shade on its bark. Now it was flat and raw, a circle of pale wood that looked like an open mouth that couldn't speak. "Ruth," Sloane called from inside, "you're not mad, are you? The guy at the nursery said it had canker. Plus, the light is so much better for my content." She said content like grace. I pressed my hand to the door jamb where the paint chips let wood splinters come through. "It wasn't diseased," I said. "It was 34 years old. It was planted the week Daniel was born. He had the decency to look guilty, my son, even if it flashed and went. We'll plant another. I'll get you a dwarf donut variety, Ma. People love those." "People love a lot of things," I said. He shifted his weight. Sloane adjusted the ring light and checked her phone camera and made a face at herself, one I'd seen 100 times since they'd moved back, some mixture of self-surveillance and practiced surprise. There was a neon sign she had ordered hanging where my great-aunt's sampler used to be, one word in a cursive loop that made the living room look like a diner in a television show: gather. Once when I was little, my mother said there are women who decorate feelings instead of handling them. I didn't understand that when I was 8. I do now. I left them and went to my kitchen. I turned down the flame on the burner to keep the jam from scorching. Before I opened the fridge for butter, I turned and looked at the spot on top where the brass rooster used to sit. That rooster had watched me age. It had watched 2 boys turn into men. It had watched me stand with a mortgage payment in one hand and a funeral bill in the other. It had gone somewhere for the vibe, and in its place was a marble slab heavy enough to sink a boat. When I was 19, Leo pointed at a lot off a county road where wild peaches were trying their best through clay soil and kudzu. The sun was low, and he was young, and the whole world felt generous. "If we plant with our hands, our boys will grow with it," he said. He was sure of himself like that. He could fix a sagging porch with 2 cinder blocks and a prayer. I believed he'd live forever until the day he didn't. He came home tired one August from a roof job and went still on the sofa with the sound of the cicadas buzzing. By the time the ambulance pulled into the yard, I knew my life had changed shape. The porch light stayed on that night, and for a week after, a small sun telling the town where we were. I kept the cafeteria job and the house and the boys and the ache in my chest, and I learned that nobody checks on whether you paid the gas bill if the water's hot and the collards are seasoned properly. The school kitchen had steam that fogged my glasses and voices that echoed off metal. I scooped mashed potatoes into bowls and looked at hands. Children give away their whole lives by how their hands move. My own hands chopped onions in the mornings and fixed leaky faucets at night. And on Saturdays I made jam because sugar and fruit will keep better together than they ever will apart. That tree watched me. It cast a shade on my porch I thought I would die under. When Daniel called to say they wanted to come home for a few months, just until they saved up their down payment, I didn't think about triangles. I thought of the spare room and the quilts in the closet and the way my kitchen sounded when more than one voice was in it. I made a pie. I set out the good plates. I ironed a tablecloth we only ever used when the pastor came after his wife left him, and the whole town learned to hold grief without poking it. I wanted to like the girl. She had eyes like polished pennies and a way of talking that turned the ordinary into capital letters. She said she was building a brand. I wasn't sure which shelf that went on, but I smiled and asked if she took cream. She took almond milk, which made me say a word I shouldn't under my breath. The little things came first. The cast iron moved to the bottom cabinet, the one that makes my back sing if I reach too far. The Bible went from the end table by the window to a shelf where the neon sign looked down on it like a joke. She called the curtains too heavy and replaced them with panels that did not pretend to keep heat in or eyes out. She brushed crumbs off the table into her palm with her phone still in her other hand, one eye on me and one on the life she was editing in the glass. She invited people on Tuesdays and Fridays and sometimes Sundays and said, "Drop by," in a tone I was supposed to be flattered by. They told her she had an eye for aesthetics. She had an eye for my things. She was not cruel. Not at first. She was soft when Daniel was around and solid when he wasn't. She took long showers and used the good towels and left them in piles I didn't comment on because I am that southern kind of woman who was taught to put things right and be quiet about it. She ate her dinners in bowls without edges and called them nourish. And she told me there was a better way to load my dishwasher. It was like being corrected by television. When my birthday came, they took me to a diner with a menu you could wipe with a cloth. 3 forks, 1 slice, Daniel said when dessert time came, and the waitress stuck 2 candles in the pie and hummed a song to make it look like more than it was. I watched him watch Sloan blow out the candles, and I watched him look at me after like he realized what he'd done and wanted a do-over you can't get. Sometimes I think the first disrespect happens in the smallest way you can miss on purpose, because seeing it would make you have to get up from the table and say something, and then everything changes. You don't want everything to change. Not yet. You tell yourself it will get better when they aren't so tired, when there's more money, when the weather breaks. The Tuesday of the chainsaw was hot and honest. Heat doesn't lie. I had cut the fruit that morning and set it to macerate with sugar and lemon zest, the way my mother taught me, with patience. I heard the engine before I knew what it was, a sound with teeth. I came out the back door and saw a man I didn't know in a company shirt around his middle, and Sloan in a white tank top and shorts, standing like a director watching a shot. She turned toward me with a face built for front-facing cameras and shouted over the noise without shouting, which is its own kind of power. "Don't be upset," she said, lips moving like she was recording in her head. "I found the cutest inspo. We're going to polish it and turn it into a coffee table. Storytelling, Ruth. It's a circle of life moment." "It's a tree," I said, and I felt something inside me stretch like a wire pulled across a field. "It's his tree." Daniel came around the corner then, not running, not hurrying. "I told her you'd be sentimental, Ma," he said, almost smiling. "But the nurse at the clinic said those cankers spread. We'll put something else there, something low. It will make the yard feel bigger." There are sentences you only say if you have never paid a mortgage with rolled coins. There are sentences you only say if you have not sat up at night figuring out which bill won't shut the house off if it waits 2 weeks. There are sentences you only say if you haven't stood on your porch with a crying baby in your arms and your husband at work and the whole weight of a life you chose balanced between your shoulder blades. He said it like it was a show they were set designing. The yard should feel big. He was 34, and the yard had not felt small until a woman with a lens told him it did. I told the man with the saw to stop. He cut the engine and looked at Sloan, not me. She made a face like he had spilled soup. He looked back at me, confused. I stood there and put my hand on the trunk like a woman saying goodbye to a friend who cannot be saved. There was a scar in the bark where Daniel had tied a rope as a kid for a swing he made out of a board and guts. That swing had hit him in the shins more times than I could tell and left him with a line that would show up under swim trunks in memory. "We paid a deposit," Sloan said, like that was scripture. I nodded at the man to turn the engine back on and go. I went inside. I closed my mouth around the piece of my heart that wasn't staying quiet. I scrubbed my hands like blood was on them, even though it wasn't. That night they went out to the briar patch and came home late. They laughed and clattered and brought the smell of heat and somebody else's fryer into my hall. Something got steady in me while they were gone. There are moments when you know the next thing you do will be the story your life tells about you. I stood in my kitchen and stared at the door to the yard where the new night sat heavy and warm, and I got my purse and keys and drove down to the locksmith on Pine. Earl has a face like the front of a burlap sack, rough and dependable. He looked up from the little stool where he was cutting a duplicate for a boy no older than my grandson would have been, if I had one. "You look like you made a decision," he said. "I did." "Is it going to make a mess?" "Probably." He put his hand on the counter like he was laying it on a Bible. "Sometimes mess tells the truth." He came out to the house and changed the deadbolt. He handed me 2 new keys and put the old one in a bin that held a history of a town in metal. He didn't look around my living room, didn't comment on the neon, which made me like him more. When he left, I sat on the sofa with the quilt my mother pieced the winter we could not afford a tree, and she insisted we could keep our joy all the same. When the fan clicked, I thought of Leo, who fixed that click twice and then said it was part of the house's song. I left the porch light on because I always have. I tucked my body into the corner where we had watched 13 seasons of a show about a sheriff who couldn't manage his family and pretended he could manage the world. At 1 a.m, I heard tires on gravel. I heard voices in the shape of their faces. The key entered and met resistance, and there was a silence that sounded like thought. Then there was a knock that pretended it was polite. "Ma," Daniel said, and the sound of my name in his mouth hurt more than if he had cursed me. "Open up. We're tired." I put my hand on my chest like you do at funerals when the hymn you loved when you were 13 rises up out of the bodies around you and you are surprised to remember the alto part. I didn't move. "You can't lock us out of our own house," Sloane said. The U.S., the hour, her voice had sugar in it, and under the sugar was vinegar, and under the vinegar was the metal of a method. "It isn't your house," I said, quiet. The quiet made me brave. Quiet always has. We stood that way for a while. They tried the back door, the side door, his boyhood window. They rattled and knocked and went away and came back and tried again. The porch light made a halo on the yard where nothing but grass was now. The night wrapped around me like a shawl somebody had knit for a woman they loved. In the morning, I made coffee and buttered toast and watered the basil she hadn't killed. I did not hum, because I come from people who do not hum in the face of victory. At 10, the phone rang. He asked for his clothes and the safe deposit box key and offered to apologize if I opened the door. I told him he could come alone. He said he wouldn't. He called again an hour later, all proper nouns and threat, and told me about the law and rights and what would happen when men with uniforms came. I told him the deed had my name on it and reminded him that the law often sides with paper. He didn't know what to do with the part of me that was steel. He only knew the woman who fed him on schedules he never asked about and kept the house neat so the neighbors would nod. It's a strange thing when your child meets your backbone and realizes it is not a rumor. By afternoon, he had gone soft. "We don't have the deposits," he said. "It's more than they say online. It's first and last and security and some kind of admin fee. They don't take checks." "I'll make you a sandwich," I said, "when you come home and say you are sorry for what you said to your mother in your mother's house." He hung up and then called back and then didn't. Neighbors have a way of coming when the world goes crooked. Mr. Kemp showed up with feed for his birds and looked at the stump and shook his head and said, "Sometimes the prettiest voice in the room wins until it doesn't." He told me he had seen Sloane tell his niece to move her car from my driveway like she was paying for any part of this life, and that his niece had looked at him like she would learn to be mean just to survive. I stood with him while he talked and thought about girls. We are raised to be good and then punished for being in the way. We teach ourselves to be smaller and then get erased. In the afternoon, a woman came whose shoes cost something and whose smile could cut cheese. She introduced herself as Sloane's sister and sat on the edge of my sofa to talk to me like she was on a panel and I was in the audience. She said she understood older women had trouble with new dynamics. She said family is a process. She said if I loved Daniel the way I claimed, I wouldn't push him into hardship. She said work is flexible. She said Sloane was building something important and a house like mine could help. She said a lot of things. I listened and watched her watch me, and the whole time my heart spoke its small language. No. When she left, she said she hoped my boundaries kept my son warm. I told her he owned 2 jackets and had hands to earn a third. 2 days later, Daniel's boss called to ask if he was sick or needed help. I said my boy had a stubborn streak like his father and would find his way. I hung up, dialed him, and said a sentence he didn't expect. "You are not the first man to be in love and wrong at the same time. Get up and go to work." There was a quiet on the other end of the line, and then I heard the sound of somebody who wanted to be small again and didn't know how. "She says you'll never forgive her," he murmured. "She says you always look down on her." I said that if I had looked down on that girl, she would have felt like a porch quilt and not like the main event. I reminded him of the pie and the drapes I let her put up and the whole cupboards I rearranged around a person who did not care that older bodies have their own geometry. He said he'd talk to her. I asked him to stop drinking. We said we loved each other and we meant it like a promise and a threat, the way mothers and sons do when the air is thin and somebody has to breathe for both of them. On Tuesday, the phone rang and it was the girl. She asked exactly what I needed to hear. She did not say misunderstanding or if or sorry in a tone that made it sound like a weather report. She said, "What do you need me to say and how do I say it so it lands inside you and not outside your ears?" I told her I needed her to name the places she had put her hands and why that was wrong in a house that was not hers. I told her I needed her to understand that not every room is a set and that not every light is a good light. We agreed she'd come while Daniel was at work and we would talk across my dining table like two women who had never had to share a man's attention to talk plainly. She came with her face bare and her shoulders honest and a bouquet from the grocery store she looked embarrassed to be holding. She looked around my living room and laughed at herself. "I like the sign," she said, glancing at the neon. "It made me feel like I knew what to do with a room I didn't understand." She told me she grew up with a mother who measured love in crumbs and a father who moved in and out the way the water company moves your bill from the mailbox to the past due pile. She told me every time Daniel smiled when I fed him a plate he didn't ask for, she felt an old fear sit on her chest, and the fear is what she spoke from. She said she made projects out of things to have something to stand on. She said she had been rude to me in ways she would never admit out loud except here. She named the tree. She named the rooster. She named the Bible. She named the parties. She named the way she used words like flexible and journey to hide decisions she didn't feel sure about. She said she had thought if she controlled the rooms, she could control the story, and that she had learned controlling is not the same thing as belonging. I listened, and I believed her. I have lived long enough to hear the difference between performance and confession. When she asked me what to do next, I told her she could come home with my son when he apologized to his mother, and could live here so long as she acted like she knew what a door was for. She asked if I would list what I mean by that, so there would be no confusion later. I told her doors are for asking before you enter, and for sheltering a body that needs peace, and for holding a house in a shape that can keep a life from spilling out. She nodded and said she would write it down on paper and tape it to the fridge and sign her name like a child who wants to belong to a classroom more than she wants to be right. They came at dusk, when the yard looks kind to everything. Daniel looked old in the way men look when they have carried the wrong thing for too long. He held me and cried without sound and promised out loud because sometimes vows need air. He said he would not raise his voice at me again. He said he knew what he had done, and he wanted the kind of forgiveness that knows the difference between forget and remember. We sat at the table where I had written rent checks and Christmas lists and condolence notes, and I took out a piece of paper and wrote in my small, neat hand, "This is my house. My decisions stand. Ask before moving or changing what is not yours. If you and I disagree, we talk private and we talk calm. Daniel does not use loyalty as a weapon. Love is not a racket. It does not shout. We share chores and meals and the making of a home without tallying who did more." Sloan read it like it was a script, which made me laugh, and then stopped and read it again like it was a recipe. She signed her name at the bottom, and then, unasked, she wrote, "If I break this, we go. No drama." Daniel signed his name too, and he pressed the pen too hard, and it left a shadow of his name on the pad under that page, a ghost of consent. I liked that. We ate chicken and greens and cornbread, and I watched her ask where we keep the colander and then put it back where she found it. It was such a small thing I almost cried. In the mornings, for a while after that, I would watch her stand in the doorway of the yard and look at the stump, like you look at a person you argued with and then realized you were wrong and it is too late to apologize. She planted marigolds around it in a ring like a crown and told me she'd read they kept pests away, and I did not tell her that there are some pests marigolds cannot handle and some they can, and what a mercy it is to figure out which is which. She took the neon sign down and put the Bible back on the table with the lamp. She left the sign on a top shelf and didn't ask me to throw it away. I didn't ask her to. You don't have to burn what you used to love what you love now. Sometimes setting it aside is enough. She cleaned the bathroom and asked if there was a way I liked the towels folded. I told her thirds and then in half, and she looked like she had learned a secret that mattered. She turned her phone face down when we talked. She told me she was going to film recipes for a while that did not require our house. She asked if I'd help teach her how to make the jam. I told her I could, and I wanted to say I couldn't teach the part where you learn to stand over a pot and stir your mother into it, but she would come to that if she kept standing and stirring at the right heat. Some things you can't hand down. You can only make room for them to grow. Daniel went back to work and told me in a voice like he was admitting something, that he had been ashamed at how fast he had used words like rights and law. He said he had hated hearing them slide out of his mouth because he had seen men use those words to talk about things that didn't require a courtroom so much as a calling home. He told me the supervisor had given him a warning and a look that said more, and that he thanked the man and took it like a man who wanted to live in a way that did not require that kind of look anymore. He brought home a 6-pack of the cheap beer and handed it to me like a tithe, and I put it in the pantry next to the sugar and smiled when I thought about communion. We made jam together that Saturday. She peeled and cut and kept the counters wiped the way my mother did, a dishcloth always in her hand like a flag of surrender and readiness. She told me stories about her childhood that made me understand why she needs cameras sometimes to be sure she exists. I told her about Leo and the porch with the clicking fan, and the day he danced me 3 steps to a radio song because the boys were gone, and the kitchen looked like only mine for an hour. I did not tell her everything. She did not either. That is as it should be between women who did not live in each other's bodies and cannot pretend they did. Neighbors came and asked after us the way towns do when the heat breaks and the sky gives you an afternoon soft enough for a porch. Mr. Kemp brought eggs, and I gave him jam, and he said he would put it on a biscuit and think about his wife till he cried. And I nodded, because grief is a fence we all rattle when it's quiet and nobody is looking. A girl from down the road who once borrowed sugar and never returned it came to ask if I had more, and I gave it to her, because keeping score will make you small, and I am too old to be small unless my body insists. I took the concrete block by the porch and poured a little water on it to make Daniel's baby footprint darken like a photograph you pull out of a shoebox. He stood over my shoulder and put his hand on my back, and he has a way of placing his hand now that feels like a man at a church door greeting the congregation. I think he learned something about coming home that he did not learn when he was 17 and wanted to be off my porch and in a truck with a girl whose name I learned and forgot. I think he learned that love is not a pie with finite slices. I think she learned that too. We let the jars sit until they sang that small song lids make when they are sealed. The first time it popped, she jumped and laughed and put her hand to her mouth like a child at a fair who sees cotton candy become itself out of air. After, when the kitchen was clean and the light was kind, she asked me how I had been brave enough to lock my son out of the house I made so he could come home to it. I told her the word brave is for people on scaffolds and in hospitals and fields. I told her the word I would use for myself is older. When you are older, you don't have time to make rooms for disrespect to rent. You put your furniture where you can reach it and tell your body and your heart the same thing you tell the women who try you. Not here, not like that. Here. I have a picture in my head of Leo with his eyes closed and his breath easy. In the picture, he is telling me the thing he used to say when the roof leaked and the car hesitated and the boys pulled the screen door off the hinges with their boy carelessness. We will hold. The house will hold. He was right in that way men sometimes get to be right, because they said it before it was true and therefore made it so. The house is held. The yard has changed shape. The stump is not a sermon so much as a note in the margin. See here what you lost, and how you learn not to lose so much again. I saw Sloane in the yard last week holding her phone up to the marigolds. She wasn't filming. She used it like a mirror to check her face and then put it away and kneeled by the flowers like she meant to learn something that had nothing to do with angles. She put her hand on the wood and did not cry. I watched from the window and decided to make tea. The Georgia Peach Festival came and we went, the 3 of us, and bought paper fans and kettle corn and stood under a tent while the mayor gave an award to a man whose family owns land big enough to hold stories nobody writes down. We bought too much from the jam seller who lives out near the Big Bend, and we talked to the woman at the stall next to his who sells soap she makes in a kitchen, a lot like mine. Sloane took a picture of me and Daniel with our mouths full of something I tried to chew quiet, and she didn't post it because it was ours, and when she told me she wouldn't, her voice made me feel like maybe we would be all right as long as we kept telling the truth that small way. At night, the porch light catches moths like ideas and the fan clicks, and I let it. The marigolds shimmy if the breeze comes the way they do, and I smell the jars we labeled Alberta Mercy like a joke and a prayer, and the names of two things holding hands. Marcus comes on Sundays with his toolbox and fixes things that don't really need fixing because he likes the way a house sounds when a man in it knows what to do with his hands. He asks Sloane questions about cameras, and she answers them like a teacher, and I watch him get his own judgments moved around by the way she answers. Daniel wipes his boots before he comes in now without me asking. He asks if I need anything from the store, and I tell him to bring flour and salt and to check the oil in the truck he is too sentimental to sell. Sometimes in the mornings I think of the night I sat on the couch with the quilt and the porch light on and the feeling of the lock in my pocket, and I'm not proud so much as grateful. I did not do something extraordinary. I did not start a movement or end a war. I made a choice any woman with a house and a heartbeat understands when she gets there. The choice to prefer peace to being liked. It cost something and I paid it in full and did not ask my sons to split it. I would tell any woman who asked to keep a little sugar in the pantry and a spare key where only she knows and a list, written in her own hand, of what her house stands for in case anyone who comes in forgets. There is a piece of peach pit I kept in a drawer the year the boys were still small and thought the world gave out trophies just for standing in it. The pit is smooth with the oils of my fingers. I hold it when I need to occupy my hand to keep my mouth closed. Sometimes I do that still when Daniel and Sloane fight about something that is not mine to fix, and I hear the sound of my voice waiting. I don't always keep quiet. I don't always speak. That seems like a good mix. On the day the weather turned, I sat on the step and watched a boy ride by on a bicycle with no hands and thought about the skill it takes to balance without clutching. I thought about Sloane kneeling around marigolds and Daniel putting his beer on the porch rail and not picking it up again until after he made sure I had water. I thought about Leo and me at 19 and about 2 suitcases and a skillet and the way things grow when you put your hands into dirt and leave a little of yourself there on purpose. When the wind moved over the field, the marigolds moved in their circle, and for a blink my eyes played a trick on me, and I saw shade where there hadn't been any for months. It is not that the tree grew back, it is that there are things that soften the heat and make it possible to stand in it. Inside, on the fridge, the paper with the rules is smudged at the edges from the oils of our hands. The signatures look less like a contract now and more like a family in ink. At the bottom of the page, Sloane added a line in pencil weeks after we wrote it, small, like she wasn't sure she deserved to say it out loud. Love doesn't make you smaller, it makes the room bigger. She didn't ask me if she could write it, and I did not mind. Some changes don't require permission, some are proof permission was never the point. On a Saturday when the light was warm and forgiving, a young couple came by to ask what variety the tree had been, and I told them Alberta, and their faces lit up like they had said a word that meant something in their own house. They asked how much water and how much shade and how deep to plant, and I told them the things I know and left out the parts you can't shortcut. The way you watch the sky and learn what clouds lie and which don't. How heat can turn a peach mealy and you must pull them while they're still firm and let them soften on the counter. How children and fruit both grow toward light but sometimes need shade to sweeten. They thanked me and walked off, and I sat on the step with my apron in my lap and wished good weather on people I will never feed. Sometimes at night I talk to Leo, not with words, not with anything anyone would call prayer, even if it is a little. I imagine him on the porch with me in a chair that doesn't squeak. I imagine him looking at the stump and the marigolds and the porch light and the paper on the fridge and saying what he always said when I went quiet and stubborn. You were right to be as you are. He was not the kind of man to say that often, and that is why it matters when he does, even now, when it's only in the place where my faith and my memory overlap and become the same thing. When people talk about forgiveness like it is a blanket you can pull up over all the places people made you cold, I want to bring them into my kitchen and show them the stove and the pantry and the window over the sink and the way all 3 of those together make it possible to keep a house warm. I want to tell them about locks that have to turn and jars that have to seal and rules that have to be written down in pencil and ink and learned by heart. I want to tell them that having a name on a deed is a detail and also the difference, and that if you want to teach a person to love you well, you will sometimes have to stand quiet behind a closed door while they knock and figure it out with the porch light soft on their faces. There are folks who would make me a villain or a hero depending on where they like to stand when they look at a story. I am not either. I am a woman with a house and a memory, and hands that do not shake if I am holding the thing I learned to hold. If you ask me how I did it, I will tell you the truth I keep in my apron pocket. You stitch your dignity into the seams of your days so tight that nobody can rip it out without tearing the whole garment, and you wear it even when the weather says otherwise. One afternoon, months after the worst of it, Sloane asked if she could film me making biscuits. I said yes, and she set up her camera and told me where to stand, and then looked at me and asked if I would rather not. I smiled and told her to keep it rolling and to not cut out my hands when I shaped the dough because the shape is the point and not the butter. She laughed and kept my hands in frame, and later she put the video on the internet with a caption that said, "I used to think home was an aesthetic. Now I think it's a practice." People wrote sweet things and rude things and true things and wrong things, and she read some to me, and we laughed at a woman in Minnesota who said my counters were dated, and at a man in Arizona who said the biscuits looked like hockey pucks, and we did not answer either of them, because not all talk requires reply. Daniel shared it and said his mother could feed an army with a flour bag and a will, and I did not like the word army in a sentence about food and love, but I liked the pride, which is different from the bad kind of proud. On the porch that evening, the light hit the marigolds and the jars on the counter caught it and bent it into the room, and I stood where I could see both. I thought about houses that are barely holding on, and about women who are about to change a lock, and about sons who have yet to learn that the person you love before or after you say vows does not have to be unaffectioned for the other to have space. I thought about girls who turn cameras on themselves to prove they exist, and about the mercy of turning them off to see what else you might see. If you walked by then and heard voices from my porch, you might have heard laughter and a chair scrape and a sentence that sounded like a prayer but was just 3 people being gentle. You might have smelled sugar, because I keep making jam. You might have seen that the porch light was already on, even though it wasn't full dark, because I keep it on for reasons that have nothing to do with who is coming home. It reminds me who I am when the night thinks I forgot.